Today's video is brought to you by Cars and Bids, my online enthusiast car auction site that recently sold this, and this, and this, and this, and this. This is the new 2024 Buick Envista, and you probably haven't heard of it. In fact, I've been asking all of my car enthusiast friends to name one new Buick, and most of them can't. But the Envista is here to help change your opinion of Buick, and today I'm going to review it and show you its quirks and features. All right, time for the quirks and features of the Buick Envista. And as you can see, this is a coupe-like SUV. Now this SUV coupe trend began now like 15 years ago with the BMW X6. And it's moved on to a lot of other luxury brands, the Mercedes GLE Coupe, the Porsche Cayenne Coupe, but it's also starting to trickle down into the mainstream brands like sort of Buick, which is kind of mainstream, kind of luxury, and they've come out with the Envista, a coupe SUV. Now, one of the notable things about the Envista is it's really not all that expensive. This car starts around $23,500, which is fairly reasonable. This particular one is equipped to around $29,000, which is a pretty impressive figure for a sort of luxury brand like Buick. Now, the Envista is based on the new Chevy Trax, the Chevrolet Trax. They have the same chassis, the same platform, the same powertrain, but the Buick is a little more expensive. The Trax starts around $21,500. The Buick is about $2,000 more, but you get a nicer looking car, maybe a little higher end, and you get the cachet of the Buick brand name, whatever that cachet is, if it's cachet at all. But while the Envista is the more upmarket luxury version compared to the Trax, the powertrain isn't really very luxury. All Envista models come with a 1.2-liter turbocharged 3-cylinder engine that makes 136 horsepower. Not particularly powerful or strong like you might associate with a sort of luxury car. And even though this is an SUV, a crossover, the coupe-style crossover that's all the rage, it's not offered with all-wheel drive. The Envista is front-wheel drive only, which kind of kills any real pretense of off-roader crossover-y capabilities. Of course, it's also only offered with an automatic transmission. It's a 6-speed automatic in all the Envista models. But while the powertrain may not be particularly upscale or luxury, the Envista does have a surprisingly luxurious look. Like I said, this one sticker price around $29,000, but it looks more expensive than that on the outside. You have these gloss black wheels that look pretty nice, and you also have gloss black trim all throughout. The fender arches, gloss black, all the trim down the windows, the mirror caps. You even have this little grooved part behind the rear doors to make it look a little bit more expensive. The powertrain may not be able to back up the luxury look of this car, but at least it does indeed have a surprisingly luxurious look, particularly for the price point. As for other exterior interesting quirks, how about the fact that there's a new Buick logo? You can see it here, different from the old Buick logo, although I must say I haven't driven or really looked at a Buick in a long time. They could have been using this logo for years now. But I suspect I would have noticed it does seem new and more modern to represent the new Buicks, apparently. Now, one other interesting thing on the back, you have these taillights on the top part, like you might expect, no real surprise, but strangely enough, that's not the brake lights or the turn signals. Instead, they're down here in the bumper. The brake lights and the turn signals share light bulbs. They're both red, and they're not actually integrated into the upper, larger, more stylish LED taillights for whatever bizarre reason. It's the same situation in front. You have these LED running lights that look like they'd be the headlights, but they're not. The headlights are down here in this smaller housing lower down, separate from the running lights, which is an odd decision, but it's what they've done with Envista. And speaking of lighting, one other thing always annoying, like all General Motors models, if you unlock the doors, the reverse lights come on, letting everyone around you know that you're backing up, even if you're not actually sitting in the car. This is tremendously annoying if you're waiting for a GM vehicle to pull out of a parking space because, well, it might not be. A big complaint I have with GM lighting. But anyway, next we move inside the Envista, where we discover the interior strength is similar to the exterior strength, which is, it looks pretty good for the money. You take a look around and you wouldn't really think this is only a $23,000 to $29,000 car. It's surprisingly nice in here, considering that the average new car costs just under $50,000 now. This is a lot cheaper than that, but it doesn't look, well, cheap. If you look around, you can see a lot of kind of high-end looking stuff. There's aluminum trim. You have it on the climate vents, as you can see. Some nice gloss black around the climate controls in the center console, and this weird wavy trim around the gear lever, which I guess looks okay. I also like on the dashboard, you have this blue stitching here, and instead of just a cheap plastic, this is still plastic. It's not leather, but they've managed to make it look textured with stitching. It looks a lot nicer, frankly, than it should, especially given the material and the price point. They've done a good job in this interior. And beyond all that, the technology is decent in here. The center screen, for example, General Motors' latest infotainment system, and it's pretty good. Intuitive, responsive, simple, easy to use. It's lacking some of the high-end features of upscale General Motors models. For instance, it doesn't even have navigation, but it does come standard with Android Auto and Apple CarPlay, so you can hook your stuff up. And it's just easy, good, simple, large displays, quick to respond. It's a good system, especially at this price point. And it doesn't include climate control functions, which can get annoying. You still have your physical climate control buttons and dials down below, so you can adjust all that stuff without having to go into the screen. Now, the other screen in this car, the gauge cluster screen, is a little bit more unusual. You can see here, gauge cluster shows you everything you need, your speed, your odometer, etc. But the weird part is you can't do anything with it. Most brands switch to a gauge cluster screen to give personalization options to drivers. But here, this is what you get. You can't change it to show the radio track or the telephone or the navigation, music you're listening to, any of that stuff. It just stays like this. It's fixed, but it's a screen, which is odd. With that said, one cool feature in this gauge cluster screen, this little display shows exactly how many seconds the car in front of you is, how many seconds your following distance is, which is cool. I've never really seen that before, and it's a nice feature to be able to look at that and know exactly how far you are behind. And speaking of nice features, this car has a decent amount of them at its $29,000 price point. You get a wireless cell phone charger, which is nice to have. You get adaptive cruise control. It won't steer for you or change lanes, but it will speed up and slow down based on the car in front. You get a heated steering wheel, which is nice, and a power tailgate in back. And I've driven some cars recently, the Crosstrek Wilderness, that was a lot more expensive and didn't have that. So some surprisingly decent features in this car and a surprisingly decent interior at this price point. Oh, and by the way, it's worth pointing out that this particular Envista is an ST model, which apparently stands for Sport Touring. This is absolutely meaningless in terms of the suspension. You don't get anything sportier. The engine power, you don't get any extra, but you do get ST embroidered into the headrest, which looks cool, and you get blue stitching on the seats. That's what comes with your ST. Plus, the door panels also have blue stitching, as you can see. It's on this plastic material, but it looks nice and sport touring-y. And next we move on to the back seat in the Envista, which is a bit of a mixed bag. As a pro, there's a decent amount of space back here. I have the driver's seat where I would sit, and I have legroom and knee room, which is a shock to me. And there's even headroom, which is even more surprising given the sloped roof design of this car. It is surprisingly roomy back here, particularly considering the price point. Usually crossovers at this price point are really small in back, but not this one. There's decent room. Another nice benefit, you get two chargers charge ports back here, one USB-C and one USB-A for charging devices in back, which is nice to have. As for drawbacks, it's worth pointing out the back seat of this car is not quite as upscale looking as the front. In back, the door panel loses its nice blue stitching that you had in front. Instead, it's all fairly cheap looking plastic. The seats also lose the blue stitching that the ST model was rocking up front, and you lose the embroidered ST in the headrests. You don't have any of that back. Instead, the back seat is definitely not quite as nice as what they have going on up front. And it's also worth pointing out the only real storage back here, you get a little door pocket, which is nice to have, and you have this hole in the back of the front center console where you wouldn't want to put anything because it'll shoot out under hard acceleration, but you don't even get rear cup holders back here. There's no center armrest to fold down with cup holders, and they won't really fit into your door pocket, and that's kind of a shame. Rear passengers like their cup holders. This car doesn't deliver. And then there's the cargo area. You pop open the power tailgate, and as you can see, a cargo area back here, which is actually pretty decently sized. Fairly flat, wide, long, decent space for some stuff, although it's not particularly tall because of the sloping roof design of this car, so you won't be able to carry tremendously large items, but some decent space and a little bit more space on the side. As you can see, this little cubby adds some extra storage room. Unfortunately, there's no storage space under the floor, but lift it up and you do have a spare tire under here, and I guess you could put some stuff with the spare tire if you wanted, although it doesn't look like it's really intended for that. All right, driving the Buick Envista, Envista. I've driven this car around for a week now. I've driven it quite a bit actually. And my assessment of the driving experience is the term that we use here in the business is uninspired. Uninspired. Front-wheel drive car, 136 horsepower. The steering is not particularly quick. The handling is not particularly good or even tuned for performance in any way. The Envista is not a fun car to drive. It just isn't. It's a car to drive. It looks cool. It looks more expensive than it is. I've been riding people around in it, and I've been asking them to guess what it costs, and they've all guessed radically too high. So there is that. But from a pure driving perspective, it's not all that great. Now, I do want to mention, this is not intended to be an enthusiast car. If you are an enthusiast with $30,000 to spend, you are not buying a Buick Envista. That's not on your radar. This will be for people who want a car in this segment at a fairly reasonable price point, to be perfectly honest, a quite reasonable number that looks and feels more premium than it is. But from a driving perspective, driving enthusiasts will not want to be a part of this car. Now, in case you're wondering why I'm reviewing this car, a Buick, it hit me the other day that no one knows what Buick is doing right now. There's no car enthusiast who is paying attention to Buick at the moment. And I thought, I might as well just review one. And so the Envista is the most interesting of the Buicks. And so I thought I would check it out. And the answer is, what are they doing right now? Actually, this is kind of an impressive car for the money. It is not a driver's car. It is not an enthusiast car. It is not a fast car. It is not a fun car. But in terms of like a daily drivable, like a cruise around in your town for not that much money, I don't really care about cars, but I want something that works kind of car, this is a pretty decent one. It has all of the tech features that you're going to want. It's nice, heated seats, heated steering wheel, good screens. I mean, it doesn't break any ground, but it looks nice and it drives okay. And because it's Buick, I have a strong suspicion that these will be available with significant deals before too long. Low interest rates, a lot of money off. So its price point, which this car's $29,000 and change, even that will probably be whittled down at the dealership if you haggle 26, 27, 28. I mean, it's a lot of car for that money. You're getting a brand name that nobody really knows about. You're getting a car that's not particularly exciting, but there are worse ways you could spend 30 grand if you're buying a car. But back to driving experience for a minute. Yeah, so it's not particularly powerful, it's not particularly fast. The initial throttle tip-in is not particularly good. In other words, you put your foot down, you don't get an enormous amount of feedback or throttle response right away. So it's slow when you're flooring it, and it's kind of slow when you're just cruising around steadily too. The ride quality is actually pretty decent. For 30 grand, it's quite decent. For a luxury car, it's fine. You hear some road noise, you hear some wind noise, you especially hear some engine noise because that tiny powertrain is sort of always struggling to do what you want it to. Visibility is pretty good despite the sloping roofline. You got big mirrors on the sides and you get decent rear view mirror situation. So you can see out of this car pretty well, and it's pretty small. So it's not particularly difficult to park or maneuver if that's your thing. And it does have a decently high seating position. I'm in some new crossovers where it almost feels like they're sedans. This sits high enough up that you do feel like you're in a little bit of a crossover with a little bit of a higher driving position, and it's kind of nice. Overall, my opinion, I would never buy this car. It's not fun, it's not enthusiastic, it's not exciting to me. I would never purchase this car, but I could see myself recommending it here and there. If someone came to me and said, look, I want to spend 25, 30 grand. I do not want a used car. You know, what do I do? I think the answer is, hey, this is something you want to consider. It's nicer than you might think. It looks kind of cool. I think resale value is not going to be great, but there's decent technology. You can kind of probably get some decent money off up front. It's like a good car for people who don't love cars and just want something maybe a little different, a little outside the box, and decently nice for the price point. And so that's the new 2024 Buick Envista. I don't think this will be a tremendously popular car. And frankly, I'm not even entirely sure why Buick still exists. But everybody seems to think this car is more expensive than it is. And so, if you want a relatively affordable car that stands out, the Envista is here. And now it's time to give the Envista a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 45 out of 100, which places the Envista here on this list of sort of similar cars. The Envista has two really big benefits, namely that it looks good and it's shockingly cheap for what it is. Otherwise, it's not particularly compelling with mediocre performance and average quality and technology. But again, it comes at a surprisingly decent price point. If you're on a tight budget, but you want a decent crossover with a sort of high-end brand name and a good look, this is pretty appealing. There are better cars on the market, but few that look as premium for the money.